The gravestone was cold. That's what I remember most. Not the grief, not the flowers already wilting in their ceramic vase, but the absolute cold of that marble against my palm. October in the cemetery. The kind of gray that makes you forget what color looks like. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I always said that. Every visit, same time, same apology. As if saying it enough times would somehow restructure the past, rebuild the timeline where I'd answered differently. Where I'd been there. It was 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I knew the time because I glanced at my phone before silencing it. Hadn't wanted the world intruding. The cemetery sprawls across 35 acres on the outskirts of Portland, and I'd chosen the quiet corner on purpose. The old section. The part where the dead had been dead long enough that nobody visited anymore. But someone was watching me. I didn't notice at first. You don't when you're replaying a phone call from 7 years ago. Trying to squeeze new meaning from every pause, every inflection. Trying to rewrite what you should have said instead of, "I'm busy, call you back." That was the gap between expectation and reality. I expected to get another call. I expected more time. A child's voice cut through everything. "Your daughter is still alive." I froze. Not startled in the way you jump. Frozen in the way your nervous system just stops. Because that sentence was impossible. That sentence shouldn't exist outside of hallucination or cruel imagination. I turned. There was a boy. Maybe 8. Blonde hair, dirt on his knees. Standing between 2 headstones about 15 feet away, looking directly at me with an expression that was far too calm for a child who just said something insane. "What did you say?" My voice came out strange. Smaller. He didn't repeat it. He turned and walked between the headstones, disappearing behind the hill. And I stood there, still touching my daughter's name. Sarah died on March 14, 2017. That's the date on the stone anyway. The actual death, the moment I signed the paperwork at the hospital, was 2:15 a.m., which felt like a lie. How could something so absolute happen at such a specifically unremarkable time? She was 19. Car accident on I-5. The car belonged to her roommate, Jessica. Jessica had been driving. Jessica walked away with a dislocated shoulder. I won't make this about blame. I made it about blame for approximately 3 years, and it only broke me further. But I'll tell you the pattern because this is where patterns begin. I miss things. Not by accident. By choice. Sarah had been my daughter with my ex-husband, Michael. After the divorce, when she was 7, I'd rebuilt. New job, new house, new marriage to David. David had 2 kids already. Teenagers. I'd been so focused on blending this family, on not disrupting the balance, that I'd turned the volume down on Sarah. Just slightly. Enough to miss the pivot points. When she was 13, she called me at work. "Mom, I'm having problems with my friends. Can we talk?" "I'm in a meeting, sweetheart. Can I call you back?" I called back at 9:30 p.m. She was already asleep. By the time I had time for real conversation, she'd learned to stop asking. When she was 16, I didn't make her soccer game. There was some emergency with David's mother. I told Sarah I'd make the next one. The next one, she didn't ask me to come. When she was 17 and told me she was moving into an apartment near community college, I didn't really register what that meant. I was relieved, if I'm being honest. One fewer person in the house to coordinate. One fewer thing to manage. The final year, the year she died, I think I'd seen her in person maybe 4 times. Phone calls every 2 weeks or so. David used to say, "You should spend more time with her." But he said it while literally scrolling through Instagram, so the pressure felt theoretical. The worst part isn't that I was cruel. I wasn't. I was just efficient. Present but not attentive. The kind of distance that looks fine from the outside but creates its own kind of grave. Then the accident happened and suddenly all I had were regrets. Real ones. Specific ones. The call I didn't take. The soccer games. The apartment I didn't even visit. These weren't vague sadnesses. These were documented failures, time-stamped and irreversible. That's the pattern nobody talks about. The small abandonments before the big one. I'd been coming to this cemetery every Tuesday and Thursday for 7 years. Rain or shine, usually 3:45 p.m. Sarah's dad Michael came sometimes but less often. He'd remarried, had another daughter, moved on. The verb itself had become bitter in my mouth. But I stayed. I stayed as punishment and prayer mixed together. Until I couldn't tell the difference. The boy didn't make sense. I drove home on autopilot, pulled into the garage, sat there for 20 minutes with the engine off, replaying his voice. The specific inflection. The total lack of effect. The way he'd said it like he was reporting something. Your daughter is still alive. That's when the possibilities started crawling in. Not hope, I wasn't naive enough for that. But something worse, the possibility that I was losing my mind. That grief had finally cracked something essential. I pulled up my phone and scrolled through every article I could find about the accident. March 2017. The details were exactly as I remembered. Local news had covered it for 2 days. Community college student dies in two-vehicle collision. There were photos of the wreckage. Sarah's name was mentioned in the second paragraph. Confirmed deceased. But I hadn't seen her body. That's what I suddenly realized. The funeral was closed casket due to the extent of injuries. We'd had the memorial service. We'd buried an empty box. An assumption. No. That was paranoia. That was the kind of thinking that leads to conspiracy forums and alienating your remaining family members. Except I couldn't stop. I started researching death records. Obituaries. Found the one my ex-husband had written. Sarah Michelle Huang, age 19, passed peacefully. Passed peacefully. That was a lie. Car accidents aren't peaceful. But Michael had written that because that's what people say when they can't face the specific horror. Then I found myself going deeper. I looked up Jessica, the friend who'd been driving. Found her Facebook. She'd posted nothing about the accident since 2017, but there was a change. Before March 2017, Jessica's feed was constant updates. After, sparse. Removed. The profile of someone stepping back. I sent her a message. Just something innocuous. Hey, I haven't seen you in so long. How are you? No response for 3 days. Then, hi Sarah's mom. I'm doing okay. Hope you're well. That okay. There was something in that. Not guilt exactly. Damage control. I typed and deleted 4 different follow-ups. Finally, do you ever talk to Sarah? The typing indicator appeared immediately. Disappeared. Appeared again. For 2 minutes, Jessica was composing and abandoning messages. Finally, I don't think that's a good idea. My hands went numb. That was the moment. That exact moment when the rational interpretation became impossible. Because why would she say that? Why would she protect Sarah's privacy if Sarah was dead? You don't protect the privacy of the dead from their parents. Unless Sarah wasn't dead. Unless Sarah had asked her not to. Unless there was a reason Sarah had been absent for 7 years in a way that didn't involve a coffin. The thought spiraled immediately into its implications. My daughter had staged her death. Or allowed it to be staged. Had faked her own funeral and let me believe she was gone for 7 years. The alternative interpretation that I was psychotic suddenly seemed less likely than the truth. That night I didn't sleep. I searched online records. Found no new Sarah Huangs. No credit card applications, no driver's license renewals. Whoever she'd become someone else. But here was what I knew. Someone had sent that boy. Someone had wanted me to know. The question wasn't whether Sarah was alive. The question was why she'd revealed it now. I went back to the cemetery the next Tuesday, 3:45 p.m. Same time. This was the difference between grief and obsession. Grief waits. Obsession hunts. The boy wasn't there. The spot between the headstones was empty. I waited an hour. Nothing. Thursday. Nothing. The following Tuesday I changed my approach. I came early. 2:15 p.m. I positioned myself where I could see the whole section. And I waited. He came at 3:40. Same dirt on his clothes. Same deliberate pace between the graves. This time I moved. Stop. He stopped. Not startled. Like he'd been expecting this. Who sent you? I can't tell you that. His voice was steady. Child voice but not childlike. There was something performed about this. Does this have something to do with Sarah? His expression shifted, the first real emotion I'd seen. Something like compassion, which was worse than cruelty. You need to go home, he said. Your ex-husband called. Said he needed to talk to you. He sounded scared. Then he turned and left before I could ask the next question. But I was already moving toward my car. Already pulling up Michael's contact. He didn't answer. But there was a voicemail. Left at 3:37 p.m. Minutes before the boy arrived. Hey, it's Michael. I need to talk to you about something. About Sarah. It's not something I can say over the phone. Can you come by the house? Diane's not here. Just come by. Please. The address was the house I'd only been to 3 times. The one he'd built with Diane. The one that replaced everything from before. I drove there with my hands shaking. Michael was waiting on the porch. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. There were new lines on his face, or maybe I just never looked closely enough. Come inside, he said. The house was sparse. Clean. The furniture looked uncomfortable. Like it was staging itself for a magazine shoot. Michael made coffee even though neither of us was going to drink it. Sarah contacted me, he said. 3 weeks ago. First time I've heard from her since. He stopped. Corrected himself. Since she left. Not since the accident. Since she left. She's alive, I said. Not a question. He nodded. Where is she? I promised I wouldn't say. And I meant that promise, I really did. But she also sent you a message. Through that kid from her community. She said if you showed up at the cemetery a second time, she wanted me to tell you the truth. I sat down. The accident was real, Michael said. The car crash was real. Someone died in that accident. It was Jessica. The words didn't make sense for a moment. They floated. Then they assembled. Jessica was driving. Recklessly. Sarah had been asking her to slow down for miles. She was scared. She called me right before it happened. Don't even know why, just panicked. I could hear Jessica yelling. Then the call cut off. Michael's hands were shaking now. When the police found them, Sarah was alive. Conscious. But she was covered in Jessica's blood. The dashboard crushed Jessica instantly. And Sarah was trapped, and she kept telling the EMTs to help Jessica first even though Jessica was already gone. But they said, the funeral said. We lied, Michael said. Sarah asked us to. She was traumatized beyond help. The therapist said it might actually be healthy for her to disappear. To become someone else. To get as far away from that moment as possible. From people who would always see her as the girl in that accident. I couldn't breathe. She changed her name. She left the state. She rebuilt her life. And you never went to see her because you were grieving, and I never went because I was respecting her boundaries and trying not to make it worse. And by the time we might have told you, so much time had passed that it felt like we'd already committed to the lie. Michael looked at me directly for the first time. She's in Seattle now. She's been in Seattle for 6 years. She's alive and she's okay, and she wanted you to know. I didn't drive to Seattle immediately. That's the part that might surprise you. You might expect some scene of immediate reunion, me racing up I-5 like a woman possessed. Instead, I went home and sat in my kitchen and did nothing for an entire day. David came home and found me there at 11 p.m., still in my coat, and he didn't ask what happened. He just sat with me. Didn't touch me. Didn't try to fix it. Just bore witness to the fact that everything had shifted. The next morning, I looked up an address she'd apparently given Michael years ago. Still valid. An apartment building in the Wallingford neighborhood. I drove there and sat in my car for an hour before going in. The buzzer outside her unit said, S. Park. Not Huang. She'd given herself a new last name. That detail more than anything made it real. You don't do that casually. You do that because you're building a new person from the foundation up. I pressed the button. Nothing. I pressed it again. Hello. A woman's voice. A woman's voice, that was the strangest part. Not a girl's voice. The voice of someone who'd built 7 years of life between that cemetery and this moment. "It's your mother." The intercom buzzed immediately, and the door unlocked. She was waiting in the hallway when I reached the 3rd floor. I recognized her. The bone structure was Michael's. The expression was something I'd never seen before because I'd never looked closely enough to see who she actually was. "Hi, Mom," she said, carefully, like she was speaking to someone who might break. And I did. I cried for the first time since the funeral. Real sobs. The kind that don't have structure or dignity. Sarah didn't move toward me. She just waited until I could breathe again. "Why did you send the boy?" I asked. "I wanted you to know I was alive. But I didn't know if you'd want to see me. I thought maybe that was the kinder option. To just let you know I existed, and let you decide if you wanted to find me." "Of course I wanted to find you. You're my daughter." "You barely knew me," she said. And she wasn't angry when she said it. That would have been easier. This was just factual. "You were busy. You had a new family. And then I was the girl in the accident, and that's who you would have always seen. Not me. Just the tragedy attached to my name." We sat in her living room. A place I'd never seen. Filled with evidence of a life I'd missed. Books. Photographs. A job in nonprofit work Michael had mentioned. Real work. Real life. "I don't blame you," she said. "I want you to know that. I was angry for a long time, but I'm not anymore. You were just a person trying to hold too many things together. And when something broke, you picked up the pieces that seemed heaviest." I wanted to argue, to explain, to somehow retrofit my failure into something more intentional. But she was right. And her rightness was something I had to sit with. We talked for 3 hours. She told me about her therapist, about the nightmares that had finally stopped 2 years ago, about why she couldn't fake a death for a parent who was actually trying anymore, about the boyfriend she had, someone who knew the real story, about the possibility, if I wanted it, of being in each other's lives not out of obligation but out of actual choice. "I don't know if I can be your daughter the way you expected," she said. "I don't expect anything anymore," I replied. "I'm just trying to see you." 6 months later, I stopped going to the cemetery. Not all at once. First I skipped a Thursday. Then I missed a Tuesday. The habit just dissolved. There was no dramatic moment of closure. I just realized one day that I was living in the present instead of the past. The headstone is still there, of course. The name. The dates. The whole apparatus of grief that we build to contain something too large to bear. But the grave itself is empty in a different way now. Not haunted by what's missing. Just quiet. Sarah and I have dinner most months. We're building something, but it's not what either of us expected. Not a traditional mother-daughter relationship. Something stranger and more honest. We're two people who share history and biology, figuring out if we like each other. I told her about the boy once. She laughed. Said she'd planned to do it differently but got nervous. Needed an intermediary. The kid was her neighbor. She'd hired him specifically to deliver a message she'd written 100 versions of and never sent. What I've learned, and this is the part I'll tell you because maybe it matters for your life, not just mine, is that some of the time you lose people, they're not actually gone. Sometimes they're just on a different road. Sometimes you abandon them before they abandoned you, and sometimes they forgive you for that before you even ask. The worst part of grief isn't the loss. It's the assumption that loss is permanent, that there's no possibility of finding your way back, that you've been given exactly one version of how things can end, and you have to accept it. But life is messier than that. More generous. Sometimes the person you think you've lost is just waiting for you to look again. And sometimes when you do, they let you in. Sometimes if you're lucky, they do more than that. They let you become someone new too. I'm still learning who that person is.